Well, thank you all for attending this meeting of the Hertford Astronomy Group Astrophotography Section. We have a special guest zooming in from the USA to tell us all about his personal journey in astrophotography. I became aware of Patrick Cosgrove and cosgrovescosmos.com when I started out myself at the end of 2020. I loved and appreciated the detailed and stepwise documented process Patrick published for the likes of newbies like me. A lot of my process steps followed Patrick's method, word by word, picture by picture, a constant source of reference for my learning. Tonight, I am delighted to introduce and hand over to Patrick to tell and present his story so far and hopefully share his next ambitions. Let's welcome Patrick.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. We originally were going to do this in December, and that happened when I was just closing on a house. So delaying that actually helped. Doing it today is kind of interesting. It closes a chapter because my old house just went on the market 30 minutes ago. And so with that behind me, I can actually now think about astrophotography again. It seems like I haven't been able to do that for a while. Between the weather and being absorbed in that process. So this might be my first bit of astrophotography time spent over the last couple of months, so I really welcome it. This will be sort of a personal journey. I haven't been doing astrophotography that long, and I've met many people who've been doing it a lot longer than I have and have a lot more skill. I still have a lot to learn. So the best thing I can do is just talk about my experience and what I did and what happened to me along the way, and hope that helps. So that's my goal here today, is just to tell you a little bit of my story. I took my first astrophoto on August 5th of 2019, and I took my last astrophoto on September 25th of last year. Hopefully not my very last, but the last one that I took. And between those two events, there's been an awful lot of learning that's happened on my part. And part of what I'd like to do today is to share what that experience has been like. One thing I do want to say is I am not an expert. I am still a novice. I'm still learning. And what I always tell people is I'm not going to tell you the right way or the best way to do something. All I can really do is talk about what I do and what seems to work for me. And your mileage may vary. So a little bit of background. My background is in image science and consumer imaging systems. I worked for Kodak for 32 years and ended up the last half of that working in Kodak research labs, working on advanced image understanding and image enhancement capabilities before Kodak went into the dustbin of history. So that was my background, but probably even more important is the fact that I've had a lifelong interest in astronomy. I was very involved in visual astronomy back in the 80s and 90s. And as you can see in the photos here, you can see my gold Dobsonian telescope, which was my main instrument back then. And I still have it and I still use it. And I spent a lot of time doing that. I was a very active member of ASRES, which is the astronomy section of the Rochester Academy of Science, which is a local group of people who do astronomy. And then something changed. In 1 year's time, I got a promotion at work with a lot more responsibility. We started a family. I went back to grad school and we built a house. And suddenly there wasn't enough time for anything other than just making it through the day. And so that caused sort of a 30-year hiatus in my activities in astronomy. But I always knew that I would go back to it. And I always thought that the key aspect that would drive that is when I had time. And I knew I would have time when I finally retired. And in 2019, I had left Kodak in 2012. I started doing consulting. I ended up working with a few small startups, and I was acting as a CTO for one startup for 5 years until it got acquired. And I thought, once it got acquired, it's a perfect time to consider retiring. So I retired, and within 30 days of retirement, I had my first rig and I was rolling. So why astrophotography? I mean, what's the advantage there? What's the appeal? First off, for me, it's a unique blend of many of my interests: science, technology, imaging, computers, all things I love to deal with. Gear, complex systems, problem solving. Again, that's very attractive to me. I've had a lifelong appreciation for the whole realm of photography, and professionally, that's what I was very much involved with. And I've always had this sense of wonder by the night sky. So those things are part of what makes it work. But I think there's something else. There's something that makes astrophotography very compelling to me. It's hard. It's a very hard thing to do. And it's hard for someone who's starting out to get to the point where they can take images they're proud of. It's very precise. It's very unforgiving. It presents a very unique set of challenges, but allows a person to capture amazing pictures of objects in our universe that you can't really see with the naked eye. It feels sort of like magic sometimes. And it seems to add a dash of the extraordinary to the common elements of our life. And I think that's what makes it very compelling for me. So I like deep sky. There's a lot of forms of astrophotography. I love doing deep sky, faint and far away. Something about the immense scale of the universe calls to me. I think this is always going to be an area of focus. So this is a good example. This is an image that I recently took. And what I mean by that is I went to the James Webb website and I took the image to put on this slide. But it's a great example.
Did you do it?
It's a great example of what gets my juices flowing. So I think there's a fairly typical journey for people who are doing astrophotography, and from your own experience, you may see some truth in this. First off, you're going to have to get some gear. So going into that gear acquisition mode, you got to get enough to do what you're going to do. And I think you'll all agree with me that once you start acquiring gear, it is a process that you will never, ever finish. You're always so the next bubble. So that part's very key. Getting your first images, getting all the gear hooked up together for the first time, getting a software to talk to one another, getting things aligned and set up so you actually have an image. I mean, there's a lot of hurdles you have to go through. And if you get your first image and it's a terrible looking image, no one should feel bad, because that is a huge accomplishment. You have passed the test. You have figured out how to get data. The rest of it's all making the data better. But getting to your first images, that can be really tough for a lot of people. Then you work on maximizing the quality of your data, setting up your equipment, getting your technique down, getting more data instead of less data. In my experience, it seems like within a few months, I was getting pretty good, and I plateaued after a year. It seemed like I understood the mechanisms of capturing good data, and that sort of plateaued out. But then you start developing your image processing skills. And I don't think that is a process which ever ends. Between your own learning, new methodologies that are coming out, new tools that are constantly coming along that make the job more interesting or more capable, I think this is something that just never stops. And finally, I think there's this thing which I refer to as developing your own inner eye. And by that, I mean, as you work on your images, you start to develop an idea of what you think your images should look like. And the decisions you make as you do every processing step and how far you take each adjustment, that sum total is sort of your look, and it's unique to you. And I always say that if you had same set of data and you gave it to 10 astrophotographers, they would produce 10 very different but very good images, because they all put their self into that process. And I think that's one thing it's fascinating. You've got all of the science, and at the same time, you have this element of art and capability. So for me, what are the key enablers for astrophotography? Well, you need an enormous amount of interest and an enormous amount of drive in order to learn what you have to learn and get to the point where you can capture images. Some would say you also need an enormous amount of money, but it can be done for less than an enormous amount. But clearly, some dollars are going to be necessary for some of the toys we need to play our games. You're going to be needing access to the sky, and sometimes that can be a challenge based on where you live, or like in my previous house, I had a lot of lovely trees, which is why we bought the property. And then I started doing astrophotography, and the trees became my enemy. Unfortunately, they weren't my wife's enemy, so I couldn't cut them down. The next aspect is if you're married, you better have a supportive spouse, because you're going to be doing lots of weird things at lots of weird hours, and having a supportive, patient spouse is really going to be helpful. And finally, I think the big thing for me, it's time, right? When I'm looking at an imaging project, I'll spend more than 2 hours planning out what I'm going to shoot and how I'm going to shoot it. Setting up my gear in the driveway and taking it down can take an hour and a half every night. If I'm capturing, we're talking about between 3 and 5 nights. I wish it were more, but my weather never allows for more. Processing can take me 1 to 3 days to finish an image. And because I tend to share what I did with that image step by step on my website, now I have to create the content for that. And that can take anywhere from 2 to 3 days. So one project might be taking, 11 days to accomplish. And that's just doing it. That's not learning new things. That's not improving your gear. So time is a big piece of what you really need to move forward. So I want to talk about what is now my old observatory. In the first image here, we're facing south down my driveway. Fortunately, that driveway is there. That created a hole in the trees. And that opening there is what I could shoot. I waited for things to emerge from the tree line on the left, and I shot it until it descended into the tree line on the right. And that was pretty much what I had to work with. Flipping around facing north now, you can see this hole in the trees, and that's where Polaris is. That hole is very convenient, but it actually didn't happen naturally. I had guys hanging from ropes, cutting off limbs of trees high up to create that hole, because since I was setting up in the driveway, I had to do polar alignment. And just full disclosure here, this is not an actual image of Polaris. It's just an incredible simulation. So I had to plan things out, and I used Stellarium to do that. I actually created a map of my tree line edges, put that in Stellarium, and with that, I could predict when something was going to emerge from the trees and when it was going to descend back into the trees. And I had a window there about 3 hours for the most part. I could shoot something. Now, in the last year, I had some more trees cut back, and that increased up to 4 hours. So I was getting spoiled with my full access to the sky there. So I had my first rig, and that came about very quickly. And I pretty much knew what I wanted after a few weeks of research. I was looking at a Williams Optic 132 FLT F7 optical tube, 50 millimeter guide scope. I wanted a CM60 ioptron mount, but I didn't know what to do with the cameras. So I talked to my wife. I said, I'm thinking about doing this, but, I still don't know what I need, what kind of camera goes with this kind of rig. I don't understand it well enough. So I called one of the local vendors that had a technical helpline, and told them what I was trying to do and what I wanted to do and what I was thinking about getting. And they said, yeah, that's a good selection. That'll all work together. They helped me identify what cameras would work well with that. That's great. Then the guy said, I asked the guy, what about supply? I keep hearing that, supply chain is terrible, that these scopes and mounts are really tough to get. And he goes, oh, yeah, we've had a heck of a time getting them. But, I've got one scope that came in that doesn't have a name on it. If you really wanted to, you could put a deposit on it now and it's yours. I go, well, what good's this scope without a mount? Those mounts, you can't get those. You say, you're right. I haven't had them for a quarter, but I got a big shipment coming in 2 weeks. And right now I've got one more mount that I have back orders, and you could sign up in 2 weeks. You could be really rolling and ready to go. I said, all I need to do is pull out my credit card. That turned out to be very easy to do. So I bought my gear. Then I had to explain to my very surprised wife what I had just done without talking to her. That was not very easy to do. And in fact, after some negotiation to make peace, I suggested that I could fill this financial hole in our budget by selling a bunch of my camera lenses. And she was happy with that. That turns out to be a key element, which we'll talk about here in a little bit. So keep that part in mind. So I had a lot to figure out. I had to figure out how to get things together. So I got the cameras on it during the daytime. I got a rough focus on some distant trees. During the first night, I did my first polar alignment using the borescope. I have bad knees, bad neck, and bad back. Kneeling in the driveway, looking up to this borescope was nothing short of torture. It was a terrible experience, but I did it. I did a two-star calibration on my mount. I won't use the go-to feature, and I pointed it at M8. I was using APT as the control software because I could get a free version, and it was simple to use. And I did my first set of subs, and I could see something come back. And that's actually what I saw. And I was thrilled because just in that picture, I saw more detail in M8 than I'd ever seen with big scopes that I looked through visually. So I was pretty excited about that. And I took this picture, I shared it with my family, and they really were not impressed. But it allowed me to take my very first image. So we have M8, 14 60-second subs. Focus was bad. The stars are not in focus. No guiding, because I didn't really understand what that was. No calibration frames, because I didn't understand what that was. Color? Where's my color? It was a one-shot color camera. Well, it turns out that you have to tell Deep Sky Stacker, what the filter pattern is before it can extract color, and I'd never done that. So I got a black and white image out. But you know what? It really didn't matter because I was completely hooked. The amount of detail that was there, the dust detail, I cannot tell you how thrilled I was. So I started shooting images, and you can see a group of some early images that I shot. These were stacked with Deep Sky Stacker. These were processed with Photoshop. All the blacks are clipped. All the highlights are clipped. There's no color in the stars. The color is somewhat random because I didn't know what I was doing. It didn't matter. Each image was a revelation to me, and it spurred me on to keep going. And I kept trying to learn the techniques that I needed to learn. I kept working at it, and finally I ended up getting this image. This was 1.3 hours, and it just seemed to have a lot of drama to me. And I guess it did because I shared it with my family. And my oldest son quickly texted back to me and said, "You took this?" And I go, yes, I did. It's kind of an insulting comment, but yes, I did take this, and I was quite proud of it. So I was starting to get images that I was beginning to like. This image turned out to be an important one for me. The reason it's important is because it was the first one that I felt confident enough to share with the local astronomy club that I was associated with. So they have a mailing list, and so I sent this image out. And what really came out of that were two very experienced astrophotographers in our local area. They've been doing astrophotography for a decade. They reached out to me, and it's formed a friendship that we still have, and I really value. And having someone who's done this already to ask all your stupid questions and ask for techniques or critique of your processing, hugely helpful, hugely helpful. So this image was a really important one for that reason alone. So some early learnings that I had as I began to do this: tell your wife before you place your big equipment order. It's easier in the long run, trust me. That 132 millimeter scope is a beautiful scope, but boy, it's a heavy scope. And when you're setting things up, lifting that tube assembly up and putting it on the mount, that's a bit of a chore. At the end of the night, taking it down when you're groggy and hoping you don't drop it, that's scary. Using the borescope for doing polar alignment, just torture, and I had to find a different way to do that. I discovered plate solving, which I thought was nothing short of magic. It just simplifies so many things. I really learned to love that. And then didn't matter how bad my early images were. Every one just got me excited to go on to the next one. And to me, they were new, and I was seeing things I never saw before, collected by my own hand, and that just kept me going. But I did want to make some improvements, and I did over time. First thing I wanted to do something about is a polar alignment. So I bought a polar alignment camera. And it was just wonderful. It's comfortable to use, simple, quick, convenient, surprisingly accurate. Suddenly doing polar alignment for a scope in the driveway was not torture. It was convenient, and I was helping to dial things in really well. So that was a great find for me. I now have them on all of my scopes, and it greatly helps when I'm doing my driveway setup. Focus motor. I started doing focus with a Batinoff screen. Not bad, but you can't automate it, and you have to stop what you're doing every once in a while to redo focus, because as this telescope gets cold and shrinks, the focus shifts, and you really need to do something about that. But with a focus motor, I can do autofocus. So I put on this one's a Pegasus Astro Focus Box 2. I used Sequence Generator Pro, and I used their autofocus routine. Dramatically better focus in my images after that. And the automation really helped when I started to lean into mono, where you're swapping filters, and your filters may or may not be consistent in or they may not be parafocal. And so it's really nice to have that. And that is something as soon as I discovered that went on in all of my rigs. The other thing I did, which is a little bit of a luxury, was getting a camera rotator. And this is the Pegasus Astro Falcon camera rotator. But it really helped me in my composition. Sequence Generator Pro has the ability to plan out your images as their mosaic framing utility. The afternoon before, I can pull up a plate for the object that I'm dealing with or will be dealing with that evening. When I drag a rectangle, it shows me exactly what the framing is, and I can move that frame around, and I can rotate it to get exactly what I want. And then as I use it during the night, it will automatically center in on that and uses plate solving to verify that you're where you want to be and you have the right rotation. And so that really helps your composition, but also helps when you're shooting more than one target a night and you're going multiple nights. You need to be able to go back to a target and get the same rotation, and being able to dial that in to recreate what you're doing in one target and then changing it for what you're doing with a second target is really convenient. So I really enjoy my camera rotators, and I have put them on all of my gear right now. So with that first telescope, over time, things changed, and I sort of did a bunch of changes here a while back. I put on a Sharpstar 61 EDPH2 as a guide scope. It's kind of a pretty hefty guide scope, but I had this crazy idea that maybe I could swap the guide camera and the main camera and use that platform for a wide field situation. I haven't actually ever done that. That was the idea, but it does make for a really nice guide scope. I also put on a flattener and reducer, which brought the F ratio down from 7 down to 5.5. And I swapped out the camera to an ASI 2600 mm Pro camera, which is a camera that I really, really loved. It was such a step up from what I was using in the past that it's just like having a whole new system. And of course, that had to have a filter wheel to go with it, and I ended up with a 32 millimeter by 7 electronic filter wheel. And so that's the configuration on that particular scope right now. A second telescope? Well, so I had to sell these images to make my wife happy, and I sold them on eBay, and it turned out that I had a chatty guy who bought one of my lenses, and I mentioned to him that, thanks, you're buying this lens, which helps me to pay for a big lens I got for a camera, which was a telescope. I'm trying to do some astrophotography. And he told me a story about how in 2003, he tried to get into astrophotography, bought all the gear, and was never successful in getting to his first image. He was very frustrated by that. But he said he had an astrophysics telescope, and he had a Lost Mandy mount and all that stuff. He bought all this great stuff, and it's just been sitting in boxes in his dining room. And he really needed to do something about that. And I suggested, well, I'm starting to learn this stuff. If you want, I could try to help you get it going again. He said, nah, my wife says I can't buy any more toys until I sell this. You wouldn't be interested, would you? And I thought, well, I just bought this telescope and my wife was not completely happy with me. A second telescope doesn't seem like a safe course of action for me to pursue. But he suggested a price which was, I thought, pretty reasonable. And I mentioned it to my wife, and as we talked about it, he finally came back and he said, "I tell you what, for this price, I'm going to give you everything." I said, "What do you mean everything?" He said, "Everything I own from astrophotography that I bought, including the red flashlights." And I mean, he had a whole collection of Naglers, and it was a ridiculous price. And I would have been a fool not to take it. And even my wife saw the deal and said, "Yeah, you got to do this." So with her permission, I bought a second telescope. More importantly, and the gentleman who sold it to me, it turned out to be a really good friend. We still are a connection. He's really into photography. We connect at that level. I've helped him learn how to use Photoshop to do things he wanted to do. And it's been a great relationship. So you never know when you're dealing with these things what you're going to run into. Never had this kind of luck, but here's the second rig. It's an Astrophysics 130 millimeter Starfire f8 3.5, kind of a slow lens. It was originally sold as sort of a planetary and deep sky combination scope. There was a Teleview 76 millimeter on there, the Lost Mandy G11, Lost Mandy tripod. And I put it all together. It took me about a year before I got it ready for astrophotography. And in doing that, I changed the mount out. I was having a lot of trouble with the Lost Mandy. It has a friction clutch on it. I kept in the dark hitting it and would mess up my calibration. So I ended up buying another CM 60 so that in the dark it would operate the same way, and my muscle memory would work the same with both. But I put on my first mono camera. Originally, I put on an ASI 1600 mm Pro. I recently upgraded to the 2600. So this was the first telescope that I had that had a little bit of reach, which made it a little bit better for galaxy work, and it had a really nice mono camera on it. And you can see the camera there in the setup that I used. Mono was a revelation to me. I mean, there's a lot of imaging flexibility. There's great efficiency. You can better deal with the gradients with light pollution. You can deal with it at each filter layer at a time. But on the other hand, it's more expensive. You got to pay for the filters that can be very, very costly. It's a larger form factor. It's more complicated to use. The optical path is more complicated, and a lot more processing has to go into it. I'm someone who enjoys the act of processing. So for me, that wasn't a negative. And I really was excited about the flexibility that you could get with mono, and between using LRGB filters and using narrowband, it just opened up a whole new world. And for me, that was so exciting that eventually I crossed completely over to mono. But as I got started, there's my first image that I ever shot with my mono camera. It was 1.3 hours, and I was really happy with the quality I got for that kind of integration time, and I really seemed to love the process. So that was where I was going to go. So this was a traditional LRGB image shot through a mono camera. And then this is one of the elephant's trunk that I tried, kind of a short integration, but this was just straight LRGB, and it came out showing what I wanted to show, but I was a little disappointed with it. And I thought, geez, why can't I go back and just grab some HA data? So the next night was still clear, and I went and got another hour of HA, and suddenly the idea of blending those two and starting to play those games, this is the first time I ever tried to do that. And again, I found that to be really exciting, just to have that flexibility and to play those kinds of games. So software, what was I using? I use Stellarium for my planning, so I can know when something's going to clear the trees and when it's going to enter the trees. I'm using polar alignment cameras. I have both a PoleMaster and iPolar. They work differently, but they accomplish the same thing, and they're both pretty simple to use. And I just so happened I ended up getting both on different platforms. For guiding PhD 2, was just amazing that something as sophisticated and powerful as this was free, right? And constantly improving. So clearly that was where I went. I used Sequence Generator Pro. There are other packages that are as good. I used that one because my friends used that one and I could ask questions. And so far, it's been adequate to my needs, and I haven't felt compelled to look someplace else yet, but that day may still come. And finally, since my scopes are in the driveway and I'd like to be inside and warm, I use AnyDesk, free version of AnyDesk, to do remote screen control. I have a laptop on my on each telescope in the driveway, and then I control it from inside the house. So those are the principal pieces of software I use, and I think it's pretty common. A lot of people are using all those pieces, so there's no revelation there. But you know, setup was getting to be an issue. Setting up 2 scopes is twice the issue. 1 scope took long enough, but you know, I really worked at it and I got more efficient, and I could do it a lot quicker. But 2 was still a bit of a chore, and taking them down after I was tired, after a long night, was even more of a problem. I wanted a better way, and that better way came from a friend of mine by the name of Rick Albrecht. Rick is a very talented mechanical engineer who knows his way around telescopes and observatories. And he was listening to me complain about this, and he asked me if I could do welding or machining. And I said, no, that's not something in my skill set. How about working with wood? I said, oh, I got a wood shop. I can cut wood. That's not a problem. So he designed something that, as he pitched it, since your 2 telescopes are on tri-piers, we can make something that'll scoop up under it, grab the tube, pick it up, and move it from your garage out to the driveway. You can paint little spots on the driveway. You can drop them right on there, and that'll simplify your setup. I go, wow, that sounds great. Instead of taking all the pieces out, assembling it and balancing it and all that, they could all be set up and I just cart it out there. You know, I like that idea. So he designed and I built the telescope lifter and mover. It's based on a 2-wheel dolly. And basically it has a carriage that scoops up under the telescope, and I use straps to attach it to the pier. Then I use a cordless drill and a jack screw to lift it up just a few inches. Then I can wheel that out safely, drop it on the driveway in magic spots, and that really helped shorten my time here. So I wanted to give you a feel of what that looks like. And one night when I was setting up, I realized when I was setting up my driveway, I have a security camera there that's motion triggered. I said, after I got done with the setup, I said, I'll bet you I could pull out enough bits to create a video of what the setup looks like. And I created this video and I posted it on YouTube. But I'm going to show you the first few seconds of that so that you can get an idea of what that setup looks like using that device. Let's see if this plays. So that gives you a little bit of a feeling what that looked like. It really made things so much simpler for me. And I especially appreciated it in the morning when I was groggy, being able to take it in. I just ended up storing them completely assembled the way I wanted to use them in my garage. And I put covers over them to keep dust and whatnot off. I had to pull the car out, pull those out, set it. It took me a very short period of time to get things set up in the light. And then once it got dark, I did the rest of the alignments and I was ready to go. So a third scope, I have 2. What do I need a third scope for? Well, it turns out my son and his wife live down in Durham, North Carolina, which is about a 12-hour drive from where we are now. And in January of 2021, they presented us with our first grandchild, a granddaughter. My wife informed me that I should plan on many more trips down to North Carolina and that they would be long stays. And I said, well, as long as we schedule around the new moon, I think that'll be no problem. She says, forget that. We're going when we're going. And I said, well, what am I going to miss out my time on the sky? Well, you do what you got to do to deal with that. So I did what I had to do. I decided to put together a portable scope. And what I ended up doing is getting an ASCAR FRA 400 a quadruplet astrograph, and I put it on a CM26, which at the time seemed to be the lightest, most portable weight I could find, or mount that I could find that allowed me to create something that was wide field and I could move around. You can see the configuration here in a little bit better detail, and you can see some of the specs going into it. I had this all broken down so I could travel with it, and it worked out pretty nice. I ended up using it at home a lot more on travel just because all my other scopes were longer focal length, and having that wide field was really nice, especially during the summer when there's such majestic areas of the sky that really want a little bit of extra room. And so this ended up being my third telescope. And one of my early images from it was the North American Nebula. This one turned out to be about just shy of 10 hours of integration. This was published in the October 2022 issue of Sky and Telescope as a 2-page spread, which was kind of an interesting experience. I had things published in Sky and Telescope before, but I never know when that's going to happen because it just shows up in the magazine. Astronomy magazine usually sends me a note with a $25 check, and most of the others usually contact me and let me know they're going to use one of my images, but Sky and Telescope doesn't do that. And so it was quite an experience to be flipping through Sky and Telescope, and suddenly there's this 2-page spread, and this image looked awfully familiar. And so that was kind of a bit of a thrill. But it allowed me to start getting wider pieces of the sky that I could begin to play with. Now, recently I did make a change to that. I moved over to the ZWO AM5 mount. The CEM26 was starting to get some slop in it, and I was having some guiding issues with it. So I was looking for something that would be a little bit more robust. I've been investigating the strain wave technology that some of the new mounts are using. It was small, it was light, it was relatively insensitive to balancing issues. And when I got it, I was kind of blown away by the drive performance. When I was using the CM26, my guiding errors were like 1.3, 1.5, and suddenly I was getting 0.24 to 0.4 at the worst. It was a dramatic improvement, and it was just so much lighter and easier to set up. I've been delighted with the mount. So that's the state this current platform is in. So here is my gallery of scopes. On the left, you have a focal length of 1085, which gives me about 1.25 by 0.8 degrees of sky. On the other end, you have the 400, which gives me just about twice that coverage. And with the recent changes I made on the Williams optics in the middle, I'm right in the middle of those two. So now I sort of have something from wide to not wide and something in between. And so as I'm looking for, preparing for clear nights, I start picking targets and matching them to the telescope that I think they do best with. And so this has been a really nice arrangement for me. I'm finding that telescopes are kind of like Hot Wheel cars or Legos, adult Legos, that you keep building and adding things onto it. You keep customizing it. I don't think any mount seems to sit more than 3 months before some new thing has to go on, and I play with it a bit more. And so there's another creative outlet. I don't know if these scopes are some kind of mechanical sculpture or what, but I enjoy that aspect of the hobby as well. So when I run 3 scopes in the driveway, I set them up. Each has their own laptop. And then the other picture here is my view inside the house. I have a 4K monitor, and I can look at the 3 instances of the Sequence Generator Pro, and I have a security camera that lets me look at the mounts. More importantly, it lets me hear the mounts. So if I hear something funky coming out that doesn't sound right, I know I better pay attention and see what's going on out there. But this is how I typically work now. I don't know if you noticed, but in the picture on each of the tables, you can see that there's a portable fan on each table. That's my anti-mosquito mechanism. Sometimes here in the early summer, we can get quite a bit of mosquito at night, and they seem to like me just fine. They try to take about a quart down as I'm working out there. And I found that having that fan there while I'm sitting there working on the laptop, setting things up, tends to keep the mosquitoes down. So that's why you might see an odd piece of gear there in my collection. All right, just a few more images I'll share with you, which were, for one reason or another, milestones for me. This is my picture of the Wizard Nebula. This was taken back in 2020. This is probably the most ambitious technical project I tried to go after. I had 12 hours of capture, but it was the first time that I captured RGB and narrowband data, and I looked to see if I could combine those together for the first time. It was a lot of work, but I was really happy with the result. And again, I just reinforced this idea that with mono, there's so many games that can be played. This is my shot of the Rosette Nebula. This is only 3.3 hours of integration, and I use my Astrophysics 130 platform. So instead of getting the whole field, I sort of just was able to focus on the center. This was an important image because it was the first image that was ever published anyplace. Astronomy Magazine published this one, and so that was a big milestone for me. This is a sunflower galaxy. This is 9.7 hours in LHA RGB. And this was one of the first shots I took with the new 2600 mm Pro camera. And I was just so impressed with the way it handled noise, the signal I was getting, and the definition I seemed to be able to pulling out with that camera. I just love the subtle details of the dust planes I was able to get with that particular. I had shot in it before, but it never came out quite this detailed, and the camera made a big difference there. This was my first shot of the Eagle Nebula done in narrowband. I had done it before in LRGB, but I've never seen it in narrowband. And there's just something about the color palette you can get there that just makes it very rich and very interesting. Everybody shoots Andromeda Galaxy, so, you know, what's one more shot? Well, this is my shot. And the only thing a little bit different about this is I did go back and I did have HA, so you can see little knots of hydrogen in the arms, and I just love that kind of detail. This was kind of interesting. I went through a period of time where one of my goals was to try to enhance the sharpness of my images. And I was doing a lot of things during setup and focusing to maximize that. But I was also doing a lot more where I was actively filtering out frames that weren't contributing peak sharpness. And I hadn't done that before. And I started to get quite a bit more detail in my images. This particular one was published in the BBC Sky at Night in October of 2022. But what I thought was kind of fun about this is there's always this, you always see this little galaxy that's in the field of M13. And what I didn't realize until I saw this picture was there's another little galaxy right in here. And I said, you know, I'm almost seeing some detail there. So I zoomed in on him, and son of a gun, you can see the core and the color of the core. You can see some structure in the arms. And even on that little galaxy, there's a hint of a core in there, and there's a hint of spiral arms in there. So one of the things I'm finding as I do this, I often go after one target, I capture it, I'm happy with it. And then I end up exploring what else is in the field and what can I see of it and what can I learn from that. And so it seems like every image that I get, there's a secondary exploration that I end up doing, which is something I enjoy, and it just adds to the reason this is so compelling. This is my Crescent Nebula. This was 11 hours and 5 minutes in HOO. My goal for this image was, you know, the oxygen shell around it is often tough to get. And I wanted to see if I could get as much detail on that as possible. So I really emphasized my processing on trying to pull out those subtle details. And when I did that, towards the bottom of it, you can start to see these strange convection cells that seem to be forming in that I hadn't noticed before. So this is one of those images where it was just fun to see what you can pull out in the detail. And this was Messier 57. I had seen some professional images that showed the outer gas shells. And of course, I'd never seen them in any of my images. So I decided to see if I could get an image in here where I could try to capture that. So I ended up getting 14.7 hours of integration. And a lot of that was in HA because I assume the gas shell will be primarily seen in that. And I did a lot of fairly sophisticated processing, at least for me, that brought out that subtle detail and was able to fold it in. And it's kind of interesting because M57 is so well known, you don't often see it with that gas shell in there. It looks kind of like a rose to me. This is the Tulip Nebula. My slide is labeled wrong here. But this was my Tulip Nebula, and I had shared this with people, and I was pretty happy. I was able to capture there. And someone came back and said, "Wow, great job! You caught the shock wave beautifully." He goes, "Yes, I did." And I said, "What shock wave? What are they talking about?" I had no idea what they were talking about. But it turns out that Cygnus X1, the first black hole ever confirmed, was in the field, and the shock wave that was from that object could be seen in the image. And there was a second case where I shot something, and then there were interesting things to be found and explored as you were playing with the image. Dumbbell Nebula is one that I shot 2 years ago, and then I reprocessed this year. And what I wanted to do there is to see if I could get any detail on the outer shells from it. And I was able to pull out quite a bit of detail with that. And in fact, I guess this was an interesting version of the image because this is the first image I ever shot where I had a hat trick, and that it was published in Astronomy Magazine in May of 2022, Sky and Telescope in September of 23, BBC Sky at Night in August of 23, Amateur Astronomy Magazine in April of 23. And for me, the first time ever, I broke into the NASA Picture of the Day. I've been wanting to do that for a long time, and nothing was ever came close. And so with this particular image, I was able to get in all those different places that I submit to. And so that was kind of a source of personal pride anyways. It also, I think, shows what can be so fascinating about mono images. These are the master images for the 3 filters. And if you look at the hydrogen alpha, it's very lacy and structured. It's fascinating. If you look at the oxygen, it's very soft and amorphous. It almost looks like angel wings or something. Then when you're looking at the sulfur presents itself sort of like what you're used to seeing visually when you're looking with your eyeball at it. And it's just so interesting to see how different those signals were. And then when you go to put them together, you have so many choices how you could choose to join them. And that made the processing a little interesting. Kevin asked if I would take a few moments from a high level and just walk through how I've been doing my image processing right now. So I'm going to do that with an example. But before I do that, I should mention that right now, almost everything is done in PixInsight. I do about 2% in Photoshop and some final polishing. When I started, that was flipped. I did 2% in PixInsight. I tried to figure it out, and I did the rest in Photoshop because I knew Photoshop for years and years. There are some new tools that have come out that really change how I process my images. Deconvolution took me a long time with the traditional method to get benefit from consistently, but it took an awful lot of work, and sometimes the benefit wasn't all that great. But now RC Astro has the blur exterminator, And it's an amazing tool that does an amazing job. And it's simple to use, and I think it's available to just about anyone who wants it. It is a premium, but it offers so much capability that it definitely changed my workflows, and I definitely use that in all my images now. Noise reduction, a big part of what we deal with is noise. And the traditional methods, there are half a dozen tools you use at different places in your image processing in different ways. And again, that was difficult for people to learn. But again, the RC Astro noise exterminator I found to work in a very graceful way. And I could get exactly the look I was trying to get. I typically don't try to remove all the noise. I like to leave some noise in to have it look more natural. But I found it to be very intuitive, and it changed my way that I process my images. And finally, star removal. I kept trying to do starless processing, and I started when StarNet first came out, and I did a little with StarNet 2. But personally, I found that there was enough remaining blemishes from stars that I always had artifacts I had to deal with, and I just wasn't ready to go that way. Then I tried Star Exterminator, and it was better, but it still wasn't good enough. And then version 2 came out, and version 2 was a big step up in performance. And I found it was good enough that since that time, all of my processing now uses a starless approach. And it wasn't enabled until I got that particular tool, for me anyways. Other tools that I tend to like, Bill Blanchard has created a lot of really interesting pixel math scripts, and working with Mike Canfield has created some new processes. And so the star reduction, his color mask tools, narrowband normalization, and the updated color mask mod are tools that I use quite a bit now in my processing. Basic approach I typically do is, I do a luminance path versus a color path. I do that routinely for LRGB. When I was doing narrowband, I used to create a synthetic luminance image, then use the same approach. But lately, I have been turned off by doing that. I'm finding that sometimes that suppresses detail that I don't want to suppress in the fainter signals you find in O3 and S2. And so I sort of backed off from that. We just talked about starless processing, so I do that all the time. The other thing I think I do, and I don't think it's unique to me, I think everybody who uses PixInsight to a certain extent uses masking as a superpower. The ability to selectively process regions of an image is something that really allows you a great deal of flexibility in your processing. Here's my preferred narrowband workflow. I like to capture narrowband data and some RGB data so I can get RGB stars. I create my color versions, and I run Blur Exterminator in linear domain on both. While I'm still in the linear domain, I go starless, and so I end up with a star image and a starless image. I then go into nonlinear, and I don't get fancy going into nonlinear. I just use the screen transfer function to the histogram tool method, because with the stars being out of the picture, I don't have to worry about impacting those in a negative way. But at that point, I do my processing. I do a modest amount of processing on the stars, but I do an extensive amount of processing on the starless image, and I use a lot of masks to accomplish that. And when I get the starless where I want it and the stars, I put them back together, and that's how it goes. But quite often, I can't use this because I didn't have the opportunity to capture RGB stars. So this is what I often have to do, which is I only have master data from the narrowband filters. I create a color image, run Blur Exterminator. I then separate the stars, and then it looks like my other process. But what I do with those stars has changed based on what image I'm working on. Sometimes I take the color out, so they're almost just neutral stars, so I don't get funky looking stars. Sometimes I go in and play games with the curves tool to try to make the stars look a little bit more normal. And I've been doing that more often as of late. But then I use the rest, a very similar process to complete the image. So I thought, as a very quick overview example of how I tend to do processing these days, I would take my image of the Wolf-Rayet 134 region. This was 15 hours of data in SHO. And I created this image and I shared it with some friends, and everyone told me that I had the image wrong. It really needed to be rotated, because when it's rotated, you see the face in the sky. I don't know if you see that in the middle of the frame. Two eyes, two stars make the eyes, and then face in there. So that's, I've been calling that the face. But I thought I'd show how I process this image. So I start with my master images. I combine them to create an initial SHO color image. Then I prepare to run Blur Exterminator. And what I do is I use the PFS image script. I run it on the image, and that gives me a measure of the size of the stars that I'm dealing with. And once I know that, I do Blur Exterminator so that the stellar adjustments are done automatically, but I don't do an automatic adjustment on my non-stellar aspects of the image. In that case, I plug in the number I measured for the star, and I use that and experiment with the parameters there to get the maximum sharpness restoration for the nebula that's in there. And I tend to run correction first, so that I can get any rounding of the stars at the edge of the field corrected before I do that. So this is what it looks like before I run BXT, and here's what it looks like afterwards. And I'm not sure with zoom and the projection how much of the finer detail you're able to see in the projection, but hopefully you'll see some. At that point, I usually use the noise exterminator at a pretty low setting, and I just sort of knock the fizz off the linear image. At that point, I go starless, and I'll end up with my my starless image and my stars image. In this particular one, I use the curves tool, and since the stars are on the upper registers there, I played around with the color curves and then did a little tweaking with the color saturation tool to try to normalize the color so they weren't quite as funky as you can get when you're doing this. That's what the star images look like after that. And then for linear processing, at this point, I do the narrowband normalization. That's not what a lot of people do. A lot of people are doing it on the whole image before they go starless, before they even do BXT. Sometimes I do that. Often I do it this way, because now I want to worry about just what's happening with the nebula and what color rendition I'm going to go after. So typically I'll do the narrowband normalization. Most of the time that tool works great. Sometimes it doesn't, and then I do this manually using the curves tool. Then I go nonlinear. I just use a simple STF to HT method to get there. And then I tweak it with a global curves transformation to get the saturation and tone scale about where I want it. At this point, I start creating color masks, and sometimes I create a lot of them. In this particular image, I decided to create a set of cool colors, and by cool colors, you can see that I'm including anything in the color gamut there that goes anywhere from almost purple to almost cyan. And so I create my original color mask, then I use the curves tool to boost the contrast on it, and then finally I will run convolution on to soften it. And that gives me a mask for just the cool tones. I did a very similar thing for just the warm tones, and I was going everything from almost magenta up through yellow, and I created that. So now that I have that, what am I doing with it, right? Well, it's pretty standard, I think, to go in, apply the mask, and then do curves transformation, where you can change the color curves to maximize the color you're dealing with. You can do rotations of colors by adjusting the others. You can change the saturation. You can even change the neutral presentation in there. So I think that's pretty common. But one of the things I started doing, which I found really beneficial, is using something like the local histogram equalization tool to sharpen that set of colors. Sometimes where you have a lot of color, you have an awful lot of detail, and you'd like to bring that out. Other areas where you don't have as much color, maybe there isn't as much detail, or maybe the detail in the warm tones wants one level of sharpening, whereas the detail in the cooler tones wants a very different level. And this allows me to customize that for both. So after doing some processing, on the left is where I started, and on the right is where I ended up. And it's not a huge difference. And again, I don't know how much of this you can see on your projection there, but it allows me to get the colors where I want them. And I try to be fairly subtle about it. And then I also try to get the detail boosted in those areas where I think it needs it based on the color band we're dealing with. In this particular image, in the center, there's actually a ring nebula. And you can't see it very well. Let me go back here. You can kind of see that blue arc in the center of the image. That's actually almost a complete circle. It's just very faint on the right side. I wanted to see if I could enhance that bit. So I tried making a mask, and so it seemed to show up in the oxygen 3 layer the best. So I used a luminance image, and I created a luminance mask. And then once I had the luminance mask, I boosted the contrast a little bit. And so now I can see the ring a little bit more, but I have all that background, and I wanted to get rid of the background. So how do I get rid of the background? Well, I used the game script to create a gradient mask, a circle that just covers the area that I was interested in. So then I put a mask on my mask, and then I zeroed out the background. And you could do it with the curves tool by setting all the curves low, or you could use pixel math and put in a very complex equation like 0, which writes 0 to all the image except the area that's protected by your mask. And with that, I ended up with a mask for just the area around the ring. And then I did a little softening with convolution on it. Then using that mask, I could go in and I used the curves tool and unsharp masking to try to bring out the detail a little bit more. It's subtle. It brings it out a little bit more. You can see more of it. It didn't quite get it to where I wanted it to go, but I appreciate having the ability to try to go after some of those subtle details in that fashion. As at that point, I pretty much add the stars back in. I use the screen star script to do that. And then I'll do a final set of tweaks globally for the image in both PI and a little bit in Photoshop. I'll add in my watermarks and any labels I have. And at that point, the image is pretty much done. So that's kind of a real high-level walkthrough of how I approach this particular image. I'm sure all of you have different ways you would go through it, but this is kind of the way I've been playing with my images as of late. I thought before I wrapped up, I just mentioned that early on, one of the things I wanted to do is I wanted to share my images. So I decided to create a website, and I had no idea how to do that. But someone told me that Squarespace was a friendly place to create a web space. So I learned to do that, and it was pretty handy. And I've created a web space now that started off as a way to share my images. And I would talk about image projects, and I would tell all about how I chose the image, what I know about the target, how I shot it, the details. But then I started putting in all the details of how I processed it. I figured if nothing else, it's a good set of notes for me if I want to remember what I did in a particular image to solve a problem. But I was hoping other people might see it and get some ideas on how they might do their processing. And so it takes quite a bit of work to do that, but it's kind of a labor of love, and hopefully some people will have some learnings from it. But I started with just putting my images there. I ended up putting in articles about my gear, about my methods, even videos. And so it's been a lot of fun. And during those cloudy winter months, I have something to keep me busy that's astronomy related. And so I've had a lot of fun pulling that together. And I've met and electronically a lot of people from all over the world. I've had visitors to the site from almost every country in the world, and it's opened a lot of doors that I couldn't have imagined. Where I have an increasingly long list of people that are sort of electronic pen pals now on projects, and so it's been a lot of fun to work with. A little while after this, I decided to try my hand at YouTube videos. And that was a bigger leap because I know nothing about video production. And in general, when I'm standing in front of a recording camera, I can't string two words together to save my life. And I have no screen presence. So it's been a bit of a challenge, but I stuck with it. I'm slowly improving. I've got 91 videos out there right now, and a slowly growing set of followers. But I did have one series in there called 2-minute tutorials for a PixInsight, where the title is a blatant lie. They can go as long as 8 or 9 minutes. But I try to take one simple concept and try to demonstrate that in bite-sized pieces, if you will. And I've gotten some pretty good response from that. The future is something that starts almost literally today. Now that our old house is on the market, I can start putting my attention to why we moved in the first place. And that was to build an observatory. For some reason, this image seems higher in contrast than it should, but this is a view standing where the new observatory is going to go. There isn't a lack of trees. There's still some trees there, but I have a much bigger open part of the sky where I need to have it. And some of the trees that are there, they're in the way. It's on property I own, and I can still take those out. And what I wanted to build was inspired by another observatory that was built by the West Texas Observatory Group, where they took a roll-off observatory and put 4 piers in it. And that sounded like exactly what I was interested in doing, something along these lines. So I came up with a design that looks like this. There's 4 piers in a roll-off roof observatory. It's going to be 16 foot wide by 20 foot long. There'll be a desk and a counter workshop area in the back. I've got the plans for it now. I've drawn up by an architect and stamped. And I've got a couple of builders I'm talking to who are interested in taking on a project like this. And I think they're capable of executing on that. So that's kind of my future in the near term. Hopefully a year from now, I'll have a much more convenient way of doing my astrophotography. So where am I today? I have my 3 telescope platforms. I've completed 131 imaging projects. I have about 704 hours of integration, which for Western New York is quite an accomplishment. I've lost an awful lot of sleep. I have a website and YouTube channel that keeps me busy during cloudy times. And I have plans for a future observatory. And frankly, I'm having a blast. I mean, I have not been bored for 1 second since I retired. I have been doing this full blast and having a great time. And I think one of the things that makes it fun is the broad astronomy community is a really interesting group of people to interact with. And I enjoy that as well. So with that, I thank you for your patience to listen. Once I get started talking about astrophotography, it's hard to shut me up. So I appreciate the patience there.
Well, thank you, Patrick. That was really interesting. Very comprehensive. Do we have any questions from anyone? That's all.
Hello, Patrick. This is David Davis, fellow astrophotographer. A comment. You showed an image of the Trifid Nebula, but I think it's labeled.
Yes.
Yeah, but I think it's labeled as
which is Broom.
Which is Broom,
yes.
Oh, did I? I did some copy and paste, and I must have missed that. You know, it's amazing to me that once you look at a deck for a certain period of time, what you no longer see.
Yeah, absolutely. I know where you are.
I'll correct that.
And that goes for setting up a telescope sometimes as well, doesn't it? You think, why is it not working? Oh.
That was a brilliant talk. I really enjoyed that. I've learned a lot about more I can explore in PixInsight. Processes you use for masking the colors and then selectively sharpening inside PixInsight was a revelation. Thank you.
Fix-it site's really interesting because you can do almost anything, which is why it's such a difficult package to learn, because you're trying to figure out what you should do. But it doesn't stop you from doing anything. So sometimes you are desperate and can try different things. And I can share with you probably 10 or 15 techniques which work really poorly that I would never use again. But every once in a while, you'll try something that seems to work. And that was one that actually worked out pretty well.
Do you have the plans for your mover?
I don't have the plans for it. So the plans were drafted by Rick Albrecht. And I asked Rick if I could share his plans. And he asked me not to do that, not because he wanted to keep it to himself or he was going to do something for commercial gain. He was worried about liability issues.
Yeah.
If somebody built it and hurt themselves, he didn't want it coming back on him. So what we agreed was, I would show pictures of it. I would show videos of it in action. Hopefully that would inspire people to come up with similar designs. I could never have come up with that design. And Rick was very clever in that not only did he design something that worked, he designed something I could build. Because if Rick built this, it would have been, he would have milled it out of blocks of solid steel and welded it all up. It would have been an amazing thing. And I have no ability to do that. I always kidded that Rick had an 18-inch Newtonian in an observatory, a dome observatory that he built himself. He built the observatory himself. He ground the mirror himself. He welded up the frame. He created the mount. He actually had an 18-inch bronze worm gear, or not worm gear, the drive gear that he cut the teeth himself on. And I always kidded that when Rick wanted to build his observatory, all he really needed was some iron ore and a bucket of sand, and he could take it from there, And he was a very capable guy, but he had to dumb himself down enough to create a design that I could build. And actually, it's worked out great for me. I've been using it for 2 years now, and I can't imagine doing driveway work without it.
I'd like to offer you the chance, if you want to, join our WhatsApp group, which is something that we share with different people, and it's an idea where you can put your images on there, and you can talk about our stuff as well. So if you'd like to throw the offer open to you, but there's one proviso. Remember, when you're working 12 o'clock at night, it's 5 o'clock in the morning over here. So when you be very careful.
Yeah, the time shift will be a bit of a challenge.
But if you want to, we'd love you to come along to it.
Okay, I'd consider that. Yeah.
We had probably 2 presentations ago, Glenn Clowder, Astro bloke.
Yep.
Yeah. So you obviously seen his YouTube. He built quite a spectacular observatory, didn't he, in his garden? To again a new place he moved to. But he drove down to us for about 2 hours and gave a presentation on his observatory. So that's an exciting project you've got coming up there. Very jealous.
Yeah, that's one of the things I'm anticipating doing as I build the observatory. I kind of like to do the same treatment that I do with my imaging projects, right? I'd like to kind of show it step by step and what problems I'm running into and how I decided to solve them, and so on and so forth. The contractor will build the basic structure, but I'm ordering and designing all the track system, and I'll be handling the automation systems and stuff like that. And so those are problems yet to be solved. And I figured as I sort that out, I can sort of tell that story as well for other people who are considering what they want to do as they consider their own observatory.
Especially the rain sensor. Brilliant. Okay, is there any other questions, anyone?
A thought for you, Patrick. I was very interested by what you were doing with your narrowband stars to add colour, and I wondered, what I do is I shoot an RGB image just for the stars.
Yep, that's my preferred way.
So I'll shoot an RGB image, I'll calibrate it with SPCC, rip the stars out, keep those separate, throw the RGB away, and then incorporate that into the narrowband image.
Yep, that is definitely my preferred way. And typically what I would do is, because I'm greedy and I'm trying to get the main image, I would try to get most of my narrowband stuff shot. And then the last night, I would come back in and I would shoot some shorter exposures just to get the RGB stars, right? And what often happens is I don't get that last night because the weather changed. And what I really need to be doing is doing that on the first night so that I have that. And what you just said is exactly in my mind, the ideal way of processing it. You have two images, you're processing, you're color calibrating them, and then you just extract the stars and then fold them together. And I think with the way that Star Exterminator allows you to extract the stars with the blending method, and then the way they can come back together, it's seamless. It really looks very nice, and that's the best way. But there are enough times that I've been stuck without those RGB stars that I had to figure out something. And I remember one point I just got rid of all the color and put black and white stars in, and nobody seemed to notice except for one person who was insulted that I put neutral stars in. I got a very strongly worded note that I was doing it wrong. So I started playing around with, well, can I make the stars look more natural if this is all I have to work with? And you can make them better. They never look perfect, but you can make them look a little bit better.
Okay, and I think Patrick, I think you'd agree. PixInsight over the last year, there's so many new automated scripts and tools and way to ease the process in terms of time and approach. It's really it's a lot simpler to use than when I was using it 3 years ago. Do you agree with that?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, so I had a 32-year career at Kodak, where I was running the research labs on imaging for consumer. So I have quite a bit of image processing expertise and image science expertise. And I thought all of that would make it very easy for me to adapt to, astrophotography. And I found that was not the case, because in consumer photography, you have plenty of signal, right? You're taking pictures of people and sunshine, and even images that are underexposed have plenty of signal, and the things that you can do there, you couldn't do, when you look at an astrophoto. I mean, you look at an astrophoto, and it's kind of funny. The stars have plenty of exposure, but the nebulae are just a few counts above the noise level, right? The noise floor, and it's all teasing that signal out, and it's all the things that I thought I knew about processing images, I almost had to throw out and go back to fundamentals and basics. And so now I know Photoshop, and I'm trying to learn PixInsight, and there's so much to learn, and it's not friendly to learn. And so then you want to say, I'll go to a YouTube video and learn it. And here's a 19-part series on how to use PixInsight, right? It's like, I don't have that kind of time to invest. And, that just seems like it's painful to learn, right? And so I think that as we get these tools that are more powerful, I think the other thing that's nice in some of these tools, especially like some of Bill Blanchand's stuff, I thought the math that he was doing in the scripts was quite impressive. But I think when he started working with Mike to pull together the processes, what's nice is it allows you to pre-visualize what different settings do. And that is so much more convenient than processing the image and saying, oh, I didn't like that, I'll undo it and do it again. Or taking small subsamples of the image and processing that and trying to see what you think that's going to do for the whole image. So I think these tools are making it much friendlier, and I think that helps. I can also remember when I was using Deep Sky Stacker, I found that to be a relatively straightforward tool to use. Then in PixInsight, I went through the tutorial for how you stack images manually, right? And I couldn't believe there were so many complicated steps with so many decisions I had to make. Now you look at the batch processing, WBPP, and look how sophisticated that tool has become. Look at all the things that you can now process with it, and even make decisions back up and do something differently. It's just amazing how sophisticated that tool is. And then once you learn how to use that tool, suddenly all this powerful processing can be done, and it's automated, and it's easy to set up, and it's easy to document exactly what you did, and and remember what you did, right? I mean, so I think, I just see these layers in there, and it's kind of funny. I've talked to people who bemoan the tools in PixInsight, which make it easier to use. The idea that if you learned how to use PixInsight and you could do all this fancy processing, somehow that set you above all these new people who haven't put in that time, right? I don't have my ego tied up in my skills for that. I just want my pictures to look better, and I want tools that let me get there in the most expeditious way possible, right? So I look at these tools and I welcome them. If the tool doesn't create a result that I find pleasing, then I don't use the tool, right? Or I change how the tools are set up. But if the tool seems to take the image where I want it to go, then I'm happy to use that tool. And if it made it easier, I'm not going to complain about that. That's great. But I agree. I think that the PixInsight is evolving it's continuing to be powerful, but I think it's becoming friendlier, and it's allowing more people who are starting to be able to create images that have even greater quality. It just takes those barriers down a little bit. And we have enough of those already. We don't need more.
Brilliant.
Have you tried AstroPixel Processor?
I have not, but I've been intrigued enough a few times to think about experimenting with it, because I've heard of a lot of people who have raved about their experience with it, and I'd like to understand it better, if nothing else. So that's something, there's a few things on my list of things I'd like to play with someday, and that's one of them.
I think one of its strengths for me is that it orders your subs by quality, and then it weights the addition of each individual sub to the total image by the quality, so that you can use your less good images to add data, but it gives it a low gain, if you like, when it adds it into the final image. So it takes a lot of the work out of triaging your images, throw away the rubbish certainly, but the marginal stuff with APP, you could use it. It will just apply it at a low weighting to the total image.
I know for myself, I've tried to do things like that by using subframe selector. Yeah. And like, for example, I mentioned I was experimenting with trying to get my images sharper. So one way I did that was I went through all my subs with subframe selector, and I looked at eccentricity and I looked at star size. And those subs that either had eccentricity that was beyond some point, or where the star size was bloated because a cloud came through, those are the frames that I just eliminated, right? So I just clipped those out. I noticed in WBPP, now you can do something akin to that by using various noise measures and they'll weight the contribution based on the signal and noise for a particular image. But I'd like to have the ability to sort of define what quality is when I'm doing that, because there's sometimes, like when I'm doing galaxy work, I'm looking for detail, right? Other times when I'm doing nebulae work, I'm looking for signal boosts, very faint signals, right? So sometimes I have different goals, and I'd almost like to be able to specify what is the measure of quality that I'm trying to go after in this particular image, so that I can kind of stack the deck with what I'm trying to achieve.
Well, Patrick, thank you very much. I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. The presentation was fantastic. We really enjoyed it. a great wealth of information. Of course, you can see Patrick's work on his website, of course, at any time, and you can also reach out to him. And yes, it's been really nice to hear you speak about your journey through astrophotography. So thank you very much.
Thank
you guys for the opportunity to speak with you, and I love having these conversations, it's great that we were finally able to do that after we had some trouble back in December. I'm glad this all came together.
Well, Patrick, I mean, maybe when your observatory is finished, you can come back again and tell us all about it.
I'd be happy to do that.